All right, welcome back. I've been procrastinating this because I'm a Bruins fan that has been in denial, but we need to talk about the Boston Bruins, where they're at, and kind of the makeup of the team, how they've been performing. We'll go through the team essentially player by player, and we'll talk about general stuff. Um, Starting off with the first line, we got Pavel Zacha on that left wing, and some of these lines have been jumbled, and this don't take these lines super seriously, but for the most part, this is what we've seen for a majority of the games. Zaka, 14 games, 1 goal, 2 assists for 3 points. Lindholm, 14 games played, 2 goals, 6 assists, 8 points. And Pastrnak on that right wing, 14 games played, 6 goals, 5 assists, 11 points. To be fair, this isn't what you want to see in terms of stats from your first line players. Um, Pavel Zacha does everything right away from the puck, but doesn't have the puck enough on his stick to do something or make it happen. And if he does, it's usually just a dump into the end. There's Is he a first line player? In reality, no. He's probably a middle six winger at this point, maybe a third line center, maybe a second line center, probably not on most teams. But nonetheless, playing with a guy like Pastrnak, playing with a guy like Lindholm, that should allow Zaka to be a little more offensively focused than he's been. And he should be doing a little more with the puck than he has. There's more to excuse me. There's more to Zaka's game than we've seen. Elias Lindholm got off to a pretty good start. Um, has been pretty quiet the past few games, but is playing very good defensive hockey. And as long as you're right, as long as you're a centerman playing a solid 200-foot game, you can take a bit of a reduction in terms of those stats. And we saw that with Patrice Bergeron, wearing my Bergeron jersey. Never quite, at or above a point per game for the most part, but played such good defense that he was contributing regardless of whenever he was on the ice. We're starting to see that with Elias Lindholm. I don't. I think his numbers will improve. I think the Bruins are in a tough spot, especially if they get a winger that gets going. But at this point, Pasternak's your guy. If you shut down Pastrnak, you're in pretty good shape in terms of goal scoring. Lindholm, Zacha combined for 3 goals in 14 games. That's not good enough. Um, Pastrnak is your lethal goal scorer on this team. And we've seen teams shut him down, throw extra hits his way, really try to get him away from those gritty scoring slot areas, right? And it's at the point where you can see that frustration starting to bubble over with Pastrnak. The past several games, he's forcing the puck into places that probably the puck probably shouldn't be going to, forcing those passes, forcing shots that aren't good quality shots. We're seeing him try to do a little too much. He's trying to play that complete game as well. We'll run back on defense, but at this point, from your superstar goal scorer, you need superstar goal production to continue to have this team be competitive. Remember, Pavel Zacha was one of a few guys who had a career year last year. When a player has a career year somewhere around their 30s or later, especially from a forward, it's usually a career year for the remainder of their career. Second line, we got Marchand, 14 games played, 3 goals, 7 assists, 10 points. We got Coyle centering that line, 14 games played, 2 goals, no assists for 2 points. And we have Morgan Geekie, 11 games played, 0 goals, 2 assists for 2 points. Coyle is another one who had a career year last year and he was very good. He's playing pretty solid defensive hockey, which is great, but you need more offense from Charlie Coyle. And when you see him driving to the net on any given night, he is on his game. He's playing well. He'll probably score a goal. We haven't seen enough of that will to score from Charlie Coyle this season, and he's been better the past few games. But you need more than 2 goals in 14 games from a second line center at this point. Brad Marchand got off to kind of a slow start, right? But has come on pretty strong lately. He looks pretty good. I was expecting to see a bit of a drop off this year given his age and how he finished last season. But he's doing all those little things right. He's leading. He's getting under the opposing team's skin while maintaining some level of, not suspension worthy, right? which is great. Morgan Geekie probably shouldn't be on a second line at this point in his career. One of those guys, younger, had a career year last year as well. 2 assists through 11 games isn't good enough, to be honest. Charlie Coyle and Morgan Geekie, you need a lot more offense from what these two guys have been given so far. Going on to that third line, we got Trent Frederick, 1 goal, 2 assists, 3 points. We got Matthew Poitras, 12 games, 1 goal, 3 assists, 4 points. And Justin Brazeau, 12 games, 4 goals, 1 assist, 5 points. I don't hate it. Frederick, there needs to be a little more. You don't see him too often with the puck on his stick. He's got a decent shot. He needs to shoot. He needs to get the puck, and he needs to shoot the puck. Poitras, I think, has come along pretty well in the past few games as well. He's finding his game. He's getting that confidence back to be an NHL player, and we're seeing that. We're seeing him now get into those gritty areas, make those kind of slot passes that we haven't seen necessarily, or we don't see a whole lot from this team. I do. I'm not sure what Poitras' stealing is. It might be a third line center. It might be a second line center at most. But nonetheless, we're seeing decent hockey from him lately. And Justin Brazeau, or pronunciation aside, has looked pretty solid the past few games. Again, this is a line that's starting to come alive. You need a little more from Trent Frederick, but he's being physical. He's throwing hits. He's being gritty, right? And that's a part of his game. And going up against other third lines in the league, you need a little bit of that grit, right? And Frederick provides that. Brazeau also provides that. But this is a guy you're seeing get to those dirty, greasy areas in front of the net, putting the puck in the net, and he's looked good doing it. He's driving to the net. He's creating those scoring opportunities. That's what this team needs to do, is get into those dirty areas, get deflections, get second chance opportunities, and score. Because they're not getting great opportunities from outside the perimeter. They're not getting great one-time opportunities, and we can talk about that more. But we're moving on to the fourth line, which has been a bright spot on this team, at least through the first 10 games. They've cooled off quite a bit lately. We got Koepke on that left wing, 14 games played, 3 goals, 4 assists, 7 points. Mark Kastelik's entering that line, 14 games played, 3 goals, 4 assists, 7 points. And John Beecher on that wing, 14 games played, 2 goals, 4 assists for 6 points. Beecher can also play center, been playing some wing. I think he's played wing all year so far. Nonetheless, this is very good production from your fourth line. We haven't seen them score at all the past few games. In limited minutes, it is what it is. But through 14 games so far, these stats are well above what you would expect from a fourth liner to produce at an NHL level, so that's great. And we've seen a bit of an uptick in their time on ice, average time on ice, their play time as a line. It hasn't warranted better results per se. Tyler Johnson also played his first game yesterday, 2 days ago, Tuesday, the 5th against the Maple Leafs. He looked good. No points, no assists in his one game, but I like the dude. I think he's solid. For depth, they have Grigory Merkulov. They have Fabian Lysell. I'd expect to see hopefully both of them at some point throughout this year. They have Ryan Tufte, who cleared waivers and got sent down. Max Jones, who cleared waivers and got sent down. And Vinny Lettieri, who spent a good chunk of last season playing on a Minnesota Wild fourth line. Looked pretty solid. Got some chances on that second line and third line in Minnesota. One of those depth pieces you can call up and can produce at an NHL level. Moving on to goaltending, you got Swayman Korpisalo. We're going to skip goaltending. We're going to go to defense and then goaltending. I'm going to try not to forget goaltending. First line, left defense has been a little bit mixed up so far. Anyway, yeah, this don't worry about left-right defense. Like Carlo usually, I don't know. Anyway, we're just going over players. Zadorov, 14 games played, 4 assists for 4 points. McAvoy, 14 games played, 2 assists, 2 goals for 4 points. Zadorov, I think, has been good. Um, he takes penalties. That's always been a part of his game, but he's physical. He leads. He'll stand up for his teammates. I think he's been a very positive presence on that blue line for the Boston Bruins. He plays very good defensive hockey. You don't expect a lot of offense from him, although we've seen that there can be offense there. This is a guy that, for the most part, has played a lot of third line minutes this year and will play on that penalty kill. So his average time on ice will get a bit of a boost, but for the most part, playing on the third line. And with this Boston Bruins team, you kind of need him to be a top four defensive player. And I think he's played well enough to warrant being a top four defenseman on this team. I know he's getting some hate already. I think he's been fine. Charlie McAvoy, I think it's Charlie McAvoy. It's what you. There's no real surprises here. At times he'll drive up into the offensive zone and be a bit of a defensive liability on the back end, right? But when he's back on the back end, which is most of the time, he's playing very good defensive hockey. He's been fine. You want a little more offense from him, but at the same time, he's been in the same shoes as Pastrnak, where he's trying to force things that necessarily aren't there, whether it's shots or passes. And hopefully we kind of see less of that and see higher IQ plays in the offensive zone. I think he'll get there. But at the moment, I don't know. I don't necessarily know if he's doing the right things in the offensive zone. And I think that's more or less just coming out of panic and frustration from the lack of scoring this team has produced. Second line, we got Charlie Coyle. Brandon Carlo, 14 games played, 1 goal, 2 assists, 3 points. And Hampus Lindholm, 14 games played, 2 goals, 3 assists for 5 points. I'm going to come out and say Brandon Carlo has been the best defensive defenseman on this team this year. I think he's been better in the defensive zone than both Zadorov, McAvoy, and Hampus Lindholm, all these guys. He's been very, very, very good. He gets better every single year. I got to throw a shout out to Brandon Carlo. Hopefully he stays healthy. He has a history of concussions, so hopefully everything stays fine with him. He's a big physical defenseman. But he's playing that stick he's playing with that stick extremely well, tying up defensemen forward sticks in his own defensive zone. I'm stumbling over words while talking about Brandon Carlo. We're going to move on to Hampus Lindholm. Hampus, I think, has been fine. He's providing the offensive scoring you want from him, you expect from him. He's not going to wow you in the offensive zone, but he'll get you points, and he'll be fairly reliable defensively. He's more of a 200 or two-way defenseman, but nonetheless, he hasn't necessarily been a liability in his own zone like we've seen him in years past. Intermittently, just throw that out there. He's not always a defensive liability, but every now and then you'll be like, ooh, that was not a good defensive play from Lindholm. We haven't really seen that this year. Moving on to that last third pairing, you got Andrew Peeke, 13 games played, just 2 assists, 2 points. He is a defensive defenseman. And you got Mason Lohrei, 10 games played, 1 goal, 3 assists, 4 points. Andrew Peeke in third pairing minutes is fine. He's okay, but he's not a guy you necessarily want to elevate up that lineup because there are question marks with his defensive game. And he is a defensive defenseman. He's not going to be putting up offensive points. That's not really never been a part of his game. Right, but this is a guy you still need to watch his minutes played, make sure you're managing his time on the ice. But if you do that, and Jim Montgomery, the coach of the Bruins, has, it works out pretty well, and he's more than serviceable as a third pairing defenseman. Mason Lohrei, very, very up and down. He is an offensive defenseman. That should be clarified. There are defensive lapses with his game. His defensive game needs a pretty fair amount of work. He's got great puck handling skills. He's got a pretty solid shot. He's got good offensive vision. But when it comes to that defensive side of the puck, you need a little more. And I'm always hesitant when I see him on a first line with Charlie McAvoy. That's why I'm saying don't worry about left and right defense. With this, I clearly screwed up multiple times. We're not going to talk about that. But when you see Lohrei paired with Charlie McAvoy, you don't necessarily know what you're going to get defensively because Lorai is very, very hit or miss in his own zone, and McAvoy can get lost in that offensive zone. So when you have both defensemen driving up, that often leaves the other team for an odd man rush against you. Um, so it's understandable they want to pair Lorai with somebody who can play defense, but at the same time it's tough. This is a guy again. His offense is solid. It's good. This is a guy that has a bright future in the NHL, but this is a guy that at this point in his career needs to figure out how to play defensive hockey at an NHL level. I think he's doing some of those things. He's a big guy. He gets into those dirty, gritty areas, which is great. But there needs to be a little more education about what to do when you're in front of your own goalie and how to tie up opposing forwards and those little things, right? And some of it's chemistry issues. We've seen Lorai with some rough passes, but he's not the only one. Some of that's just chemistry, and you'll work that out with games and practice. So not a huge concern there. That'll hopefully get worked out. But Lorai is someone to talk about. Parker Wotherspoon in 5 games has no points. Again, more of a defensive defenseman. Serviceable as a third line pairing defenseman. Had a couple rough games this year, but it was a bit out of character for what we usually see from Parker Wotherspoon. I'd like to see him a little more in the lineup, but it is what it is. They also have Ian Mitchell down in the AHL, Alex Regula down in the AHL, and Jordan Osterley. 3 guys that could be called up to fill a third pairing defenseman role if you need them to. All right, I didn't forget about goaltending. We got Swayman, we got Korpisalo. Swayman, 3.14 goals against to this point, 894 save percentage, and Korpisalo, 2.7 goals against, 894 save percentage. I was surprised they had the same save percentage. They also have Brandon Bussey and Michael DiPietro in the AHL. Both guys at this point probably deserve a look at the NHL. DiPietro's played very well in Providence. I haven't looked at their stats this season, so take that with a bit of a grain of salt, right? But both of these guys looked pretty solid last year, and you'd think would get a look at some point. You got Bussey, who's 26, DiPietro, who's 25. Starting to get a little up there, kind of getting stuck in that AHL goaltending realm, per se. I'm just going to say it, Swayman hasn't been bad. Swayman and Korpisalo for the most part. Both of these guys, their first games played, not the greatest. Korpisalo looked rough. Swayman looked like he hadn't played a game in quite some time. And both of these guys worked their way out of it. We're seeing Korpisalo a little more reserved in net, and I think that's really helped his game. He's not getting caught out of position too often as he was earlier in the season and as he was in Ottawa and Columbus. He's a very active goaltender who likes to be outside of his blue paint. Swayman, I really do think has been fine. He hasn't been the problem. I don't have an issue with that contract. Is it a lot of money? Sure. But do I understand? Yeah. Has he earned it? Yeah, you could say that. And whether you have issues or not, his goaltending has been solid. There have been defensive lapses in front of him, both goaltenders that have led to goals against. I don't blame the goaltenders. I don't think it's been bad goaltender play that has allowed this team to lose more games than they've won. Right. So that aside, I want to talk about what do I want to talk about? I don't know. I wanted to talk about something, but I forgot. So we're going to talk about coaching instead. Now, Jim Montgomery is the coach of the Boston Bruins. I don't hate what he's done. He's tried a bunch of things. I've scratched my head at certain things. There was a game where we saw Koepke take a few shifts to start a game off on that first line. The next few shifts on that first line was Kastelik. And then I think we saw Beecher for a shift on that first line afterwards. And 10 minutes into the first period, and their first line looked terrible. they looked awful. Right? But at the same time, we've seen Marchand bump up on that first line, and it hasn't necessarily worked out too well. This is also when Marchand was struggling at the beginning of the season for the most part. But when you're looking at the options Jim Montgomery has, there's not a whole lot, right? You're really struggling to find top six forwards. We've seen Brazeau hop into that second line role in place of Morgan Geekie. He's playing well. I think he's kind of found a bit of a home on that line. I think he plays well with Coyle and Marchand. But again, you have a lot of guys who had career years last year that may not necessarily hit that career mark in terms of stats again. And that happens. That's okay. Right? But you need a little more. Defensively, I think there are kinks to be worked out. I don't think he's found the right matchups for defensemen. Right? We're seeing a lot of Carlo Lindholm, which is fine. I'd rather see Lindholm and McAvoy paired together on that first line. I liked it when we saw it back then, back when Lindholm first came over. That's still my preferred first line, but Carlo Lindholm finally, after a lot of games played together, have found some type of chemistry on that second line, and it's been fine. I have no issues with that. Zadorov, I think, should be that first line guy to complement McAvoy. So McAvoy can maybe drive into that zone, get a little more offense, and Zadorov can play more of a defensive role, more of a shutdown defenseman type. That's what I'd personally like to see, but you still have a bit of an issue with this third line, right? Assuming Peak and Lohrei are playing well, you have a guy that can drive into the offensive zone, and you have Peak who will be defensively responsible. Or Wotherspoon, who could be defensively responsible as well. But at the same time, both of these guys need to be playing well. We've seen both of these guys have defensive lapses in their own zone. The third pairing, to me, is a bit of a question mark, and you want to balance some of that out, and that's what we've seen Jim Montgomery doing. Lohrei on that first line, moving Zadorov on that third line, balancing some of these defensive pairings out to provide a little more stability on your blue line. And from a coaching aspect, I don't hate it. My biggest gripe with coaching this year has been the special teams, the power play, the penalty kill. The power play, it's tough. It's tough. I felt like last year this team overperformed on the power play with the pieces they have. And this year we're seeing a more pedestrian power play. But at the same time, where are these goals going to come from? You got Pastrnak, you got Marchand, and then really, like, Coyle can provide offense on that power play. Zacha can, but we haven't seen it. Lindholm, I'd like Lindholm personally in that bumper position. I know that's where he feels most comfortable. I watched a few interviews with Lindholm in the past. Elias Lindholm likes to be in that bumper position. He's been out on the wing, right out by that face-off dot on either side throughout the year. Pastrnak is trying to be Alex Ovechkin and lines up for that same one-timer slap shot from the face-off dot, and it hasn't worked. You need to find something new. Everybody, including the opposing goaltenders, know that shot is coming from this player, and I love Pastrnak. I have a Pastrnak jersey I spent a lot of money on, but he is no Alex Ovechkin, and that's perfectly okay because he doesn't need to be Alex Ovechkin. He's a very different player than Ovechkin. Right? It's not just you got to score goals, but it's also a little bit about the playmaking too, right? So there's that. That's the defense or the penalty kill also has been pretty poor, and I think you can kind of draw that up to preparation and schemes. I think both of those need attention. They've both been very similar the past few years. Teams know what to expect on the Bruins penalty kill and power play. You got to change it up. You got to have a little diversity in there, right? Whether it's on a per game basis or per period basis, you got to throw a little curveball in there once in a while, and we see some of the good teams do that. Especially on the penalty kill, you don't usually see an identical penalty kill from Stanley Cup contending teams every single time you're on the power play. You see something a little different sometimes, and it throws you a loop, right? But overall, although I am a bit of a Jim Montgomery critic, I have been. He's a great guy. I think he's a good fit for the Bruins. But I have been critical in the past about his inability to make in-game adjustments or Um, his firmness on these lines, and I don't think we've necessarily seen those things I've critiqued in the past this year from Jim Montgomery. We do see some of the same, well, this isn't working. We're getting shut out against the Toronto Maple Leafs, for example. We're not going to really change our lines. I think we just saw Brazeau go to that second line. I think he might have even started that game on the second line. I don't really remember. But you don't see a whole lot of line jumbling and switching up as the game progresses. But honestly, I don't put any of the, the rough start on Coach Montgomery. You want to get some of these players going, but again, maybe he's already gotten these players to their career ceilings last year, right? I do put a lot of onus on general manager and president Don Sweeney, and president being Cam Neely. The more I'm learning about Don Sweeney, the more I'm learning he's a bit of a pawn to Cam Neely. And I think it's good to have a good working relationship between those two roles, but at the same time, you also want to let the general manager do their job. And I don't know. I just have questions about how this team is made up. And just for fun, I started a franchise mode with the Boston Bruins in NHL 25 last night. And I was a little annoyed that I couldn't really do anything with this team from a general manager standpoint at this point. You have 5 of your top 6 forwards have some type of protection against trades. Marchand, I think he only has an 8-team no trade list, but he's also your captain. That's one of the guys you're probably not going to trade. You got Lindholm locked up, you got Zaka, you got Pastrnak, you got Charlie Coyle, right? And the rest of the guys that you don't have locked up are younger guys who may continue to grow their game, right? Morgan Geekie, Brazeau, Patra, Trent Frederick, who I believe is an unrestricted free agent after this year. Frederick, yup, this is his last season under contract with the Bruins, for example. Same with Brazeau, unrestricted free agent, right? Some of these guys, you could trade Brazeau, but you also need offensive scoring, and you're not quite getting that. Overall, I think the defense can be fine. I think you're going to have to win games if you're the Bruins. You're going to have to win those low-scoring, gritty games. You're going to have to get in those dirty, gritty areas in front of the opposing goaltender, get those greasy goals. Because the offense, in my eyes, is a big weak spot. If you can't keep the puck in the opposing team's offensive zone, you're going to spend more time defending, and that's going to put a lot more pressure on your defenseman and your goaltender, and that's going to lead to goals against, regardless of how good your defenseman and goaltender are. And that's what we've seen from the Bruins this year. Right. Back to the GM. I also want to note that your top 4 defensemen also have some form of trade protection, right? So, you're talking about your top 9 players for the most part here, all have some form of trade protection. And the guy with the least amount of trade protection is probably one of a few guys you're not open to trading because they are, they're the face of the franchise at this point, right? So on defense, you got Peak, Lohrei, Wotherspoon, and some AHL guys who, but when you're looking at the overall trade value of guys that can be traded, it's not that high. You might be able to get a little more from Patra, but again, he's a player who is very young, Bruins drafted, coming on strong. Right, it's a player that probably has the highest ceiling, I'd say, of any other forward on the team. Right, I don't know, but you got to do a little shake-up. I'd love to see Lysell in. He's a very offensively forward player. Not going to give you much defense, but he's a guy that can pass and put the puck in the net. Merkulov, more of a 200-foot center, but nonetheless is a guy that can pass and put the puck in the net. And that's kind of what you need to inject into your lineup. And I don't know, man. Defense as well. I think Ian Mitchell should get a chance. He's looked very good when he's played in a Boston Bruins uniform. There's the whole thing with Peak and his injury, and I don't necessarily know. But from a general manager standpoint, This is a team that's in win now mode, and the pieces you have and have given trade protection to might not be able to get you there. Again, you had the record breaking season 2 years ago with Bergeron and Krejci back on extremely team friendly deals. You had a bunch of guys have years last year, but that's not a sustainable method to success, especially in the NHL. Especially when some of your young guys that you're supposed to be drafting and trading for prospects don't necessarily pan out to be top 6 forwards or top 4 defensemen, right? You have Lohrei who might, you have Patra who might, you have Lysell who might. Merkulov, I think, it's tough to say where his ceiling is because we haven't really seen him play a whole lot in an NHL uniform. Maybe a third line center, maybe a second line center. I couldn't tell you. But at this point, you need to get these young guys into the lineup and see what they have. So you can, you don't like what you're seeing, you can at least trade them while they have some value instead of losing them in unrestricted free agency. A big example of that would be with the Minnesota Wild, Michael Chaffee. He was in the Iowa Wild. he was stuck in Iowa Wild AHL purgatory for a few years. Finally hit unrestricted free agency, signed with the Tampa Bay Lightning, and he's a staple on their NHL roster. And he doesn't look bad. He looks pretty solid and played pretty well in the AHL. Those are the types of things that can happen. And I've critiqued with the Minnesota Wild on doing the same thing, right? So I have a lot of questions when it comes to the decisions that this organization has made the past several years. And I don't know, like, I think we're starting to see the Bruins for what they are. I think they're a little better than what they've been, but I think we're talking about a pretty mediocre team at the end of the day. I think you're talking about a winning record per se, excluding overtime losses, but one of those fringe playoff teams that may miss the playoffs. And I'm just thinking realistically here. I don't want to see that. I'm a Bruins fan. I watch every Bruins game. But some of these games are tough to watch. They're tough to watch, man. That's just, now my Bruins fandom is just, I'm just venting, right? Realistically, I think you'll see a points increase from Zacha, from Coyle, from Morgan Geekie, from Trent Frederick. And that's if the other guys continue to roll. Pastrnak potentially, depending on who that winger is on his line, and if Elias Lindholm can get a little more offensive production going. But there are concerns on this team, and I think a large part about this is from the makeup and roster build of this team through general manager Don Sweeney and president of hockey ops Cam Neely. As much shade as I've thrown at Don Sweeney the past few years, it's also just as much of a doing from Don Sweeney or from Cam Neely as it is Don Sweeney. I think if you're gonna fire one guy, you gotta fire them both. And I think that's tough. Cam Neely does a lot. He's a legendary player. I think he has his number retired, right? It's tough to fire one of those guys from your organization. But if it's not working, it's not working. This is a team that when you start to see that downfall, it's going to be it's going to be a tough time. It's not going to be an easy rebuild because of the trade protections and the contracts you have. Lindholm, Zadorov, both locked up for several years. Pastrnak, McAvoy locked up for several years. Charlie Coyle has 2 years left. Right, Pavel Zacha, 3 years left. 3 years left. I have it right in front of me, and I'm not even using it. Right, it's even Carlo, 2 years left after this year, and I like Carlo, but it's going to be tough to either get to rock bottom or be a Stanley Cup contending team. And if you asked me going into last year, and my answer stayed the same, is this a Stanley Cup contending roster? The answer is no. This is not. This is a team that could make the playoffs if they play defensive, stingy hockey and win those low-scoring battles and games. But in general, is this a Stanley Cup contending team? Absolutely not. Would I love to see them win a Stanley Cup? 1,000%. That's my dream. I still watch videos on the 2011 Stanley Cup run that the Bruins victoriously finished and held up the cup after. But there's a lot of pieces that have been falling off this team from really age, right? And these pieces haven't been replaced. You got a bit of a replacement years after. 4 years, Elias Lindholm, kind of a second line center. I wouldn't necessarily say he's a first line center type of guy, but he's better than a third line center. I think he played third line center in Vancouver when he was there, right? Very, very strong defensive center. I like him a lot. Big Elias Lindholm fan, but at the same time, that's not a replacement for Bergeron or Krejci. You can't look for replacements, but you need players that are competent in those positions you're putting them in, right? If you need a first line center, you need a player that's competent in being a first line center. If you need a second line center, you need a player that's competent being a second line center. Charlie Coyle, realistically, is a very good third line center, and that's about his ceiling. He's a low end second line center. Even last year when he had a career year, and he was fantastic last year. And he does a lot of little things right. And he's a great person, great family, but this is you need to be realistic with your expectations of players when you insert them into your lineup. Marchand, a middle six winger at this point, right? Has played well recently on that second line, but at the same time, it's getting to the point where on most teams he's probably a third line winger, depending on which team he goes to, right? So there are questions. If it is a decline, it's going to be a tough decline for the Bruins because of the situation this team is in with their contracts, with their players, with their prospects, with their draft picks. Not a whole lot of prospects. They're pretty much all on the board. I include Jackson Edwards, Jack Edwards, if you will, who was a sixth or seventh. He was a late pick, and he's looked pretty good in training camp and preseason. That could be a bit of a surprise, bit of a defensive defenseman, but fairly solid in his own end. Right, he's not on the board, but for the most part, I have some worries as a Bruins fan, and that's why this video is taking so long. There's a lot more I could talk about, but I won't because I've already talked for about 40 minutes. I could talk for hours about this, but yeah, this is where we're at. So if you stuck out, I appreciate you, and take care. All right.